Nazis consolidated their power in Germany, the world-famous conductor, Sir Thomas Beecham, took his orchestra to Berlin and made this recording on the new equipment. It was a disaster.
It sounds truly terrible. In fact, Sir Thomas was so horrified by the quality of what he thought was tape that he reputedly refused to use it until, I think, 1951.
Then, just as war was breaking out in 1939, came an accidental discovery that changed utterly the prospects of the magnetophone. A German radio engineer, Walter Weber, stumbled on a signal processing method called AC bias that enabled the magnetophone to record high fidelity.
Weber one day was experimenting with circuits, advanced circuits that would try to get this horrible noise and distortion to a minimum and make the tape sound better. And he discovered, quite by accident, AC bias, this oscillating tone you would superimpose over your recorded information that would make that recorded information stand out.
A second test was carried out on the new improved magnetophone. It was the revolutionary breakthrough that German technicians had been searching for.
This was the introduction of the high-frequency bias magnetophone to the public. And it took place in a huge Berlin cinema, and people were amazed. That was the moment. That was the moment everybody recognized instantly that's the best method for recording music, and that will make a revolution.
By the 1940s, as Germany launched its assault on the Soviet Union, the magnetophone became a must-have item for wealthy Germans. An American document at the time described how Hitler himself, at the height of the fighting, acquired his own machine.
Hitler was first introduced to the magnetophone in his headquarters on the Russian front in 1942, and immediately he ordered a plane to bring additional symphony recordings from Berlin.
So Hitler was photographed.
The Nazi propaganda machine knew when it was on to a good thing and exploited the new possibilities that the magnetophone offered.
There are about 6 recordings of Adolf Hitler's speeches during the World War. And Hitler didn't come to the studio, so the studio came to Adolf Hitler, and they used transportable units of magnetophones to record these speeches. These recordings were edited and broadcasted to the public for propaganda needs.
Hitler sobbing, Hitler smiling, Hitler shouting, Hitler working his people into a frenzy.
Hitler's propagandists discovered the magnetophone could be used to time-shift the Führer's speeches. With a sophisticated radio network, inherited by the Nazis from the previous democratic regime, Hitler could record a speech on tape in one city for transmission in another. There were even suggestions that Hitler used the new technology to deceive his enemies as to where precisely he was.
There's a persistent myth that still lives today that, Hitler ordered the invention of the magnetophone tape recorder to fool the Allies as to his whereabouts. Well, that's nonsense. When high-fidelity tape recording came along, yes, they recorded Hitler. Yes, his speeches were tape-delayed and sent around. So, of course, anybody in the Allied command listening to monitoring German broadcasting would hear him pop up, well, gee, this is coming out of the Munich transmitter, and all of a sudden we're getting a speech, and he's making local references to Hamburg, and now he's in Berlin. How are they doing this? Well, the same way they always did, clear back to the 1920s, with an advanced, high-quality live network with some sort of time delay device, in this case, tape.
As the war drew to a close, the plunder of Nazi science and secrets by the victorious Allies began. U.S. Army Signals Corps Major Jack Mullen and his team were given the task of rooting out new German electronics. Mullen had been intrigued by the quality of late-night wartime German broadcasts.
I thought I was pretty familiar with what all types of recording were, film and disc, and this sounded superb, and we thought probably Hitler must be having people work all night.
Then, on a visit to a radio station a few weeks after the German surrender, Mullen heard an AC bias hi-fi magnetophone.
I'd never heard anything like that in my life before. I couldn't hear any background noise, very clean, no distortion that I was able to hear.
Mullen copied the blueprints, shipped 2 surplus machines back to America, and in May 1946 went public with his Americanized tape recorders. It changed the course of the broadcast and music industries.
It was a sensation. May 16, 1946 is a breakthrough date in American tape recording technology.
Where the blue of the night.
Bing Crosby was the first Hollywood star to use this new technology from Nazi Germany. Crosby found live radio a chore, and when he heard about the amazing new machines, he hired Mullen to record and edit his show for later broadcast. It was a first.
The little piece of tape that I'm going to play on here was actually recorded in 1947, and it still sounds as good as it ever did.
Where the blue of the night meets the gold of the day.
The first show, Bing's rating shot back up. The switchboard at ABC, NBC was flooded with calls from LA residents. Why didn't you tell us Bing was going to be live? We wanted tickets.
So post-war, the magnetophone revolutionized sound recording. But for the Nazis, it was simply an existing technology they could exploit, a pattern for much of the science used by the Nazis. Indeed, some historians dismiss the traditional view of teams of researchers ruthlessly pursuing a Nazi science. It was often much more haphazard.
And if you think of the popular image of the Nazi, you have the immaculately tailored officer and the professor in his crisp laboratory coat, and they're dealing with the highest level of technology, and they have some maniacal plan. Now, the maniacal plan idea is absolutely correct, but the rest of it is totally false.
In fact, one of the most important scientific inventions of the 20th century was developed by German scientists, and the Nazi leadership didn't seem to care. This is the common view of science and technology under the Nazis. The mentally ill and the victims of the concentration camps were used as guinea pigs in medical experiments. These lives, in the view of Nazi ideology, were not worth living.
They began to experiment on people, and they violated the Hippocratic Oath. They violated any kind of norm in medical science. It's not surprising that that's what people associate with Nazi Germany.
But the story of German technology during the Hitler years was more complicated than the common perception of evil scientists carrying out heinous experiments.
Well, we tend to regard science in the Nazi period purely in terms of black and white, as cruel experiments done by Mengele or other people on these concentration camp prisoners, when in fact you have a massive scientific state that's developed, that is pioneering medical techniques, that is pioneering rocketry and optical techniques in industry, chemistry, all aspects of science. So the period is much more complex and more rich and more interesting historically than the simple story of abuse of science in the concentration camps.
Hitler's fascist regime had come to power in Germany in 1933. The shocking reality was it happened in one of the most scientifically advanced countries in the world. At the time, Germany could boast half the world's Nobel Prize winners and the best part of the world's technological patents. Most Jewish scientists were removed from their posts. A substantial minority of the rest, more or less willingly, became members of the Nazi Party. Many of the scientists who refused to join the party continued their research and were responsible for some of the most important inventions of the 20th century. But much of this research had its roots in democratic Germany before Hitler even came to power.
There were a lot of technological discoveries in many different areas, from quantum physics to biology. So there was a real flowering of science during the Weimar period.
One of these inventions would revolutionize scientific research. Work on the electron microscope had begun in 1920s Germany and came to fruition in 1931. Science